everybody. Thanks for showing up. This is very important, as you know. My name is Rosanna Woods. I'm the new Assistant Director of Financial Aid here at the law school. So if you ever want to just stop by and say hi or chat about your loans or anything, just come stop by and say hi to Audrey and I. We love when people come visit us, right, Audrey? This is Dr. Jeff Hansen. I'm sure you've met him before. He is the best in what he does. He travels all around to counsel graduate and professional only students. Yep. Okay, about student loans, loan repayment, and debt. So, without further ado.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. I worked with Rosanna when she was at UC Hastings.
Yes.
So it's great to see that she's here at USF. Today represents the first day of the rest of your financial life. Now I know that sounds a bit trite, but if you're like 85% of all law students, you're likely borrowing money to go to law school. And so since you're borrowing money, it means that you're going to have to pay it back, and that's going to come from your future income. And so how much you're borrowing in law school is going to have an impact on your financial future. So I think it becomes very important to make sure that you're being smart and strategic about how much you're borrowing, and that you're borrowing not necessarily the minimum amount, but the right amount to get your law degree. Now, how many of you are concerned about or worried about the fact that you're borrowing money to go to law school? All right. How many of you think you should try to borrow the minimum amount possible to get your degree? How many of you think you should be paying the interest on the loans that's accruing while you're in school if you could? And how many of you think once you graduate and your loans enter repayment, you should try to get this debt paid off as fast as you can? Okay? Well, the reality is, those are things that are probably not in your best interest. It is probably not in your best interest to borrow the minimum amount possible. It is definitely not in your best interest financially to be paying the interest on the loans as it's accruing, even though the government and your loan servicer are telling you that it would. And it is probably not going to be in your best interest long term to pay off this debt as fast as you can. So the purpose of this seminar in part is to help you understand why those assumptions you came in with may not be in fact the right things to be doing financially. And so that in order to make sure that you're making the best decisions about how you're managing the financing of your education and therefore influencing your financial future, that you're making well-informed decisions. Because once you have that knowledge of how the loans work and how they're different from other kinds of debt, then I think it's going to relieve a lot of that anxiety you all admitted you had because you're having to borrow money to be in law school. So over the next 50 minutes, what I want to do is to help you understand how to make the decision as to borrowing the right amount. We're going to give another seminar at 5 o'clock tonight that's going to focus on repayment strategies and how to manage loans if you're planning a career in public service, either working with a government agency or a nonprofit, and therefore are hoping to take advantage of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. So if you're interested in that and you're available, make sure you come back at 5 o'clock in this same room. I will be back for a couple of days in February and a couple of days in March, and we'll be doing some loan repayment seminars during that visit, so you may want to come to those sessions as well. One other thing I'm doing while I'm here is I'm meeting with individual students, and so if you're interested in meeting one-on-one with me, all you need to do is contact Audrey in the Financial Aid office, and she can schedule an appointment. There's only a couple of appointment slots left for this visit, but I will be back in February and in March, so you're certainly welcome to meet with me then if you think it would be helpful. You have a copy of the slides, so you're certainly welcome to follow along. It's being videotaped, so if you have to leave before we're done, you certainly can watch the video. Having said all that, let's get started. Are you ready to get started? Okay, now I need a lot more enthusiasm than that. You got free food. All right? It's a beautiful day in San Francisco, and the Giants won last night. And, well, I'm sorry, I'm a Phillies fan myself. But also, I'm going to help relieve that anxiety that you have about borrowing money to go to law school. So let's try this again. Are you ready to get started? Yeah! Good. All right. Because it's all about understanding that as a law student, you're graduating with an educational mortgage, along with 85% of all law students in this country. And I think the use of the concept of a mortgage is very appropriate, because this is the financing you're needing to make this investment in yourself. If you could have afforded to pay for law school by yourself, then you wouldn't need the financing. But if you had to wait until you could save up enough money to go to law school, you might be dead. And so there wouldn't have been the opportunity. The whole point of a mortgage is to give you the ability to make an investment that's going to give you financial benefits long term. but be able to make that investment before you can actually afford to pay for it, so that you start getting the benefits of that investment sooner rather than later. And that's definitely what we're trying to allow you to do here, to let you become the lawyer that you want to be and to do what you want to do professionally sooner rather than later. And if you asked a person who had a mortgage, what are you most concerned about? My guess is what they would focus on is, number one, when are they going to get the debt paid off? When is it going to be gone? And will it be gone by the time they're ready to retire? And two, can they afford the monthly payment? Most people who have a mortgage probably couldn't tell you how much in total they borrowed, or at least how much they owe at this point, because they borrowed what was necessary to get the house or the condo. All right? Just as you should be borrowing the amount necessary to make this investment in yourself. And in terms of what you want to focus on is, can you afford to pay this money back? Will it be paid back in a finite period of time? And will, in paying it back, will that somehow impact your ability to do other things? And that's where federal student loans are different and unique. Because with federal student loans, they differ from all other forms of credit in three important ways. It's why I characterize federal student loans as debt with a little d, and all other forms of credit as debt with a capital D. And that would include credit cards, car loans, home mortgages, and even private student loans. And what distinguishes whether it's a little d or a big D is the second bullet point. With debt that has a capital D, that's all other forms of debt other than federal student loans, your monthly payment is always based on how much you owe. And that creates risk. Because what if you have a loss of income or an unexpected expense, and now you can't afford to make that monthly payment? Since it wasn't based upon your ability to pay it back, if you miss it, now bad things are going to start happening. You're going to start damaging your credit, possibly putting assets at risk. So in order to minimize your exposure to that risk, to avoid the possibility of that happening, you should borrow the absolute minimum necessary to achieve your goal and get that debt paid off as fast as you can. That will minimize your exposure to that risk. But with federal student loans, debt with a little d, you have the ability to make payments not based upon how much you owe, but based upon your income. And that is a significant and important difference. And I can tell you that without knowing anything about you, without knowing how much you're going to have to borrow, without knowing what your future income will be, that if you choose the payment plan of the 7 that are currently available, to repay your federal student loans that would give you the lowest monthly payment, then your monthly payments will always be less than 15% of whatever your gross monthly income is. Which means you'll always have more than 85% of your gross monthly income for everything else, including being able to start saving for retirement, being able to save the cash needed for the closing costs and the down payment to buy a home or a condo, to get a mortgage, a traditional mortgage, to be able to save the money for emergencies, to be able to save for your children's education. Your student loans, federal student loans, should not be the reason that you can't afford to do those other things, provided your income would have allowed you to do them anyway. So that's really the significant difference, and it provides much more flexibility in terms of how you manage this particular mortgage over any other kind of debt that you would have. Secondly, it's the safest form of credit you're ever going to have, because you should never have to miss a payment or default on a federal student loan. Because if for some reason you can't afford to make an upcoming payment on a federal student loan, all you have to do is contact the servicer, the company that's managing the loans, and explain to them why you can't afford to make the payment. And then they'll help you to either temporarily postpone repayment with a deferment or forbearance, or reduce your monthly payment to reflect the change in your circumstances. So payment relief will be available, and as long as you've arranged for it before you've missed the payment, then you won't have to miss the payment, so it won't have that negative impact on your credit that it would have had if it was any other kind of debt. So it really provides a safety net that you don't have with any other kind of debt. In fact, you don't really have it with any other kind of expense, because I don't know of any other expense where if you couldn't afford to pay for it, you could get a pass. But that's essentially what's possible here. Now, it's not a free pass, because the longer you take to pay back the loans, the more interest you will have paid. But if at least it's giving you the flexibility and the safety to know that your circumstances, should they change, won't cause you problems in terms of managing this particular obligation, then that should be of relief to you. And finally, one way or the other, the debt's going to be gone within 25 years once you start paying it back. Either because you've paid it all back yourself, or at some point in time you've qualified to have a portion of the debt forgiven, either because you've done public service or because you've simply been in repayment for a long enough period of time and are using one of the income-driven plans. And so if there's debt remaining after a finite number of months, the remaining balance gets forgiven. So these three things make this debt very flexible, very safe, but you also have the ability to make prepayments without penalties. So if you want to pay it off as fast as you can, that's fine. It's just that from a financial perspective, if you do that, it's coming at the expense of other things you could have used that extra money for, which from an opportunity cost standpoint, given this very flexible, safe form of debt, it might have been better to use those funds for those other purposes. This educational mortgage should not be the reason you can't pursue the career you want, regardless of how much income it might produce. And it should not prevent you from being able to achieve the other financial goals that are going to be important to you in a reasonable amount of time, provided you're strategic about how you approach what you borrow and strategic about how you approach the repayment of that. We're going to focus today on the strategy associated with deciding how much to borrow. In the loan repayment seminars I'll be doing in the spring, we'll focus on how do you want to think strategically once you have to start paying the money back. It is important to be strategic. You want to plan and you're borrowing wisely. You don't want to just spin the wheel and take a chance. You want to be making sure that you're borrowing exactly what you need to be borrowing. Don't leave it to chance, because you're in charge. No one else is. Because you get to decide how much you're borrowing. And that's going to be directly related to how much you decide you're going to spend. How much you spend definitely impacts how much you borrow. So how did you decide how much to borrow? Well, the Financial Aid Office determined how much you were eligible to borrow based upon the school's cost of attendance and any scholarship and grant funding you were getting. But when they notified you of what you were eligible to borrow, that wasn't intended to be prescriptive. That wasn't what they necessarily thought you would need to borrow. In order to really figure out what you need to borrow, you need to be doing some examination as to how much do you have in expenses and what are you going to have to borrow in order to cover those expenses. Because it's very possible you could end up borrowing less or need to be borrowing less, at least during the academic year, than what the law school says you're eligible to borrow. But if you're not giving some thought to it, then you may not be doing it correctly. And of course, you want to make sure you're borrowing the minimum amount needed to achieve your goal, or in this case, the right amount, because it's going to impact your future in terms of when you pay it back. It's going to be impacting what you can use your future income for other purposes. So how do you go about making sure you're borrowing the minimum or the right amount? Well, first of all, you need to BYOB, and it's exactly what you think it is. It stands for Bring Your Own Bag. I bet you thought I was going to say beverage, didn't you? All right, that's because you need to bring your own bag that has your own beverage in it. But here's why you need to be bringing your own bag. And by the way, I mean a food storage bag or a food storage container. You have gotten free food today. And look back in the back row right now. Just take a look. Everybody turn around. There is food left over. There are beverages left over. That is always going to happen because the organizations that put on these noontime programs are always overly optimistic as how many people will show up. And yet they know they have to bribe you to come. Well, you've gotten a free lunch. If you had a way to keep a sandwich for tonight, you'd also have a free dinner. So that would save you a little bit of money. But more importantly, it would save you time. And your most valuable resource while you're in law school is not money, it's your time. You want to make sure that you're making the best use of your time, because if you're not, then you're not necessarily putting all the energy in that you could for studying and doing as well as you can academically. And if you had a way to keep a sandwich for tonight, then you wouldn't have to go home or go out to get dinner. You could stay here, you could keep studying and perhaps get done sooner so you could go home sooner. But BYOB also stands for Build Your Own Budget. You want to be thinking about what you need to be spending to accomplish your goal. SOS is not a cry for help, it stands for Save on Spending. Anything you can do to reduce what you have to spend is going to reduce how much you have to borrow. So it just makes sense to be trying to do that. And you need to make sure that you're considering opportunity cost. Opportunity costs are associated with the trade-off between how you use your scarce resources, your time and your money. You want to make sure that you're always putting those resources to their highest and best use, because otherwise, then it's costing you something to not do that. You want to manage your finances wisely while in school, and you actually have to spend a little bit of time managing your loans in school. And so we'll talk about what are the steps you need to do with regard to that. So let's start with building your own budget. What is a budget? Well, it's really a spending plan. Although the school has given you information about what it might cost to come here, that's the cost of attendance, that is not intended to be prescriptive. It is not what they think it should cost you, it's just what it might cost you, and that determines how much financial aid you can receive. But your spending should really be based upon, your budget should be based upon what you have to spend and what resources do you have to spend it. But you have to be mindful of cost of attendance, because whatever that amount represents, whatever that total is, that represents the maximum amount of financial aid you can receive for that academic year. And so you've got to make sure that to the extent you're depending upon financial aid to help you cover your expenses, that you're going to be able to get enough financial aid to cover those expenses. Because if you can't, then that's going to lead to financial stress and financial problems, and perhaps cause you to have to rely upon debt with a capital D, like a credit card, or in your final year, the bar study loan if you're needing it for the bar study expenses. Now, a couple of things to note is that in terms of this, and by the way, these are the numbers for this academic year, a portion of this is something you don't have control over. The tuition and fees are set by the university, so you don't have control over that now that you're here. Books and supplies, you have some control over that because you decide what books and supplies you're going to purchase and whether they're new, used, or whatnot. But the rest of these expenses are all expenses you control. They're your living expenses. And you want to be mindful of what is the number. It's $28.33 that they've come up with for what it should cost you per month to be a student here at USF living in San Francisco. If your living expenses are more than that per month, then you can't get enough financial aid to cover those expenses. So how are you making up the difference? And a couple of examples of where they might be higher is if you have credit card debt or a car loan, they can't include, they being the school, when calculating your cost of attendance, the fact that you might have to be paying back credit card debt or a car loan. And they can't give you extra financial aid for that purpose. So you just want to be mindful of the fact that if your expenses, in terms of your living expenses, are more than what the school has estimated, then you're not getting enough financial aid to cover all that. So how are you making up the difference? But you also want to be mindful of sitting down and thinking about it in the context of what resources you have. And the resources you have are your scholarship and grant, the funding you've gotten, the free money from the school, money you've been able to save, any money your family is giving you, any earnings you can get while in school. Now, as a first-year student, you're not supposed to be working, but in the summers and in the second and third year, you hopefully will be able to get some in-school earnings. Do you have other resources? The resources here are the money you don't have to pay back. It's the free money. And you want to make sure what they are so that when you look at in the context of your costs, that you then can compare those costs to those resources. Because once you subtract what your costs are from your resources, then the balance is likely how much you need to be borrowing. And if you're borrowing more than that, then you're perhaps borrowing more than you need to. But you also want to be mindful that this cost of attendance is for the 9 months of the academic year. But what is your goal? I don't think that your goal is just to get a law degree. It's to be admitted to the bar in some jurisdiction. All right? And that's going to take 6 months after you graduate before that likely can happen, assuming you pass the bar exam on your first attempt. You know, when you started law school in August of whatever year that was, it's going to be 3 years and 6 months from that date, if you're a full-time student, before you will know your bar results and can be admitted to the bar. Well, that's a span of 39 months. But you're only getting financial aid for 27 of those 39 months. You're getting financial aid for the 9 months of each academic year. But you still have to live those other 12 months. Now, maybe you'll be able to earn income, and that will help. But if you can't earn income, or if you don't get a paid position, how are you going to cover those expenses? Well, maybe you'd have to use your credit cards, but that's debt with a capital D. Maybe if you didn't have to borrow all that you're eligible to borrow during the academic year, you might decide to borrow some of that excess near the end of the academic year, so you could use this debt with a little d, your surplus financial aid, to help you with those expenses for which you didn't get extra financial aid, but for which you certainly can use any loan funding that you didn't need during the academic year to help you make those expenses. And it would be better to be relying upon debt with a little d, federal student loans, than to be relying upon any other form of debt to cover those expenses. So just be mindful of that. Thinking about how you're using your resources, make sure that you're taking into account that it's not just the 9 months of the academic year you have to be worried about, but really the ultimate goal of getting through the point where you've been admitted to the bar and you're actually earning an income as an attorney doing whatever it is you plan to do. Because you've got to make sure you've managed up until that point of time. And you want to think about how you're spending your money. For example, are you living alone or are you living with a roommate? If you're living alone, you're probably paying at least $300 more per month on housing than if you lived with a roommate. So is it worth it to you? Is that additional cost of value to you? If it is, then it's probably worthwhile. If it's not, then you need to reevaluate. What about the food and beverages? Are you bringing them from home or are you buying them here? I've been buying lunch here every day and it's costing me at least $10 a day. Well, that's $10 that I could be using for something else. So just again, be mindful of the opportunity cost associated with your choices. Are you subscribing to cable? And if so, is it worth it to you? Are you really watching it? Because if not, then you're spending money you don't need to. Now, are you going to be buying new clothes? Are you going to eat out? Are you going to take a weekend off? Are you going to go to sporting events? Well, you probably do all of those things. Because if you're not, you're going to burn out. But just be mindful that there's a cost associated with how you're spending that money and that money could have been used for some other purpose. Like saving it for the summer expenses, saving it for the bar study expenses. So just make sure that in how you're spending money, it is the best option for you. Because you want to make sure, as I said, that you're mindful that you're putting all of these resources to their highest and best use. And do the little things count? Yes. If you could spend $5 less per day, that means you would end up borrowing about $3,000 to $4,000 less over the 3 years of law school. And that could be important to you. More importantly, it could be the difference between having $3,000 to $4,000 available to help you with the bar expenses and the living expenses after you graduate so that you don't have to borrow the bar study loan. Any questions about that? All right. What about managing your finances? It means getting your financial ducks in a row. Well, first of all, if you're going to develop a budget plan, you better stick to it, because if you don't stick to it, then you kind of wasted your time. You've got to remember that there's a certain amount of work you're going to have to put into managing your loans. Not much, but a little bit. You need to keep accurate financial records, particularly if you tend to use debit cards or write checks. Make sure you're keeping track of how you're spending that money so that you don't overdraw the account. Also make sure that in terms of paying your bills, you're always paying them on time. You're not missing payments, because that's going to start to negatively affect your credit. And you need to develop and maintain good credit. You need to make sure that while you're in law school, you're doing everything you can to maintain and develop the best possible credit history that you can. So how do you stick with your budget? Well, one way is to make sure you're tracking your spending, to be aware of what you're spending. Because if you're not aware of what you're spending, you're likely spending more than you realize. And one way to do that is to only use cash. Because when you use cash, you immediately can see how much is left. So you can immediately evaluate the trade-off. Do I really want to spend this much money right now, or would I rather have some of that money for later in the week? Because if you have $100 in your wallet and you're going to spend $20 on something, and that leaves you with only $80 for the rest of the week, if that's not enough, then it may motivate you to not spend that $20 now. You want to make sure that you're thinking about how you're using your financial aid refund. Because essentially, with financial aid, you get paid once every 4.5 months. You get your financial aid refund at the beginning of each semester. And given the cost of attendance here at USF, that amount could be well over $10,000 that you got as a refund. And if you have all that money sitting in your checking account, it could very well be giving you a false sense of exactly how much money you have to spend each month and each day. So I'd encourage you to transfer that money into a savings account or another checking account. And then on a monthly basis or twice a month, whatever works for you, pay yourself from that holding account. That way, when you look at the account you're spending money out of each and every day, it doesn't give you a false sense that you have a lot more money than you really do. Does that make sense? Because I don't know of anybody that gets paid once every 4.5 months. And if they did, it would probably be very difficult to make sure the money lasted for that full length of time. Something else you may want to try is what I call the big chill. It's a way of testing to see, is your budget really realistic? Have you really come up with a spending plan that's going to work? And the way the big chill works is that, for example, this weekend, sit down and think about on Friday how much you can afford to spend over the weekend. Then get that much money out of the bank in cash. Then put all of your plastic cards, your credit cards, your debit cards, your ATM cards, put all of them in a metal bowl, fill it with water, and freeze it. That's why I call it the Big Chill. Now go ahead and do whatever you want this weekend. If you run out of money before Monday morning, then you have only 3 options. 1, you stop doing things that cost money, you only start doing free things. Well, the best free things you can do are studying and sleeping. All right? But there's also other things you can do here in San Francisco that wouldn't cost you anything, like going to the parks. Or you could borrow money from one of your friends, likely one of your classmates. Wouldn't be a good idea. Or you could go back to that metal bowl, thaw it out, which means just putting under hot running water for a couple of minutes, and then take the plastic, get more money, and go do whatever you were going to do. But if that's what you do, if you get more money, now it means you couldn't stick to that budget for the 2 days. And if you can't stick to your spending plan for 2 days, then you better reevaluate, is your spending plan really realistic? Because if you can't stick to it for 2 days, what makes you think you're going to stick to it for a week, a month, or the time you're in law school? And I actually tried this because I was concerned that because I speak with a lot of law students, which can be kind of a litigious group, if somehow putting their credit cards in a metal bowl and freezing it with water could damage the cards, they might be upset with me. So I tried it a number of years ago. I was living in Chicago, and at noon on Sunday, I ran out of money. And I was with a friend, and we were out kind of shopping around, which I shouldn't have been doing at that point. We went into this store that doesn't sell anything that people need. It sells candles, it sells other kinds of decorative items for your apartment or your home. Basically, it only sells what I refer to as tchotchkes, all right? And I saw this beautiful fountain made of slate, and it was cost $100, and it was very new age, and I thought, oh, I'd love to have that fountain. And if I'd had a credit card or some way to buy it with plastic, I would have. But I didn't, so I couldn't. Now, on the way home, 2 things occurred to me. One was that I already had a fountain that I didn't even use. So this would have been a redundant fountain. Secondly, I was traveling all the time at that point, as I am now, so I never could have used it. So it was an impulse. I had the impulse that I wanted to buy it, which is exactly why credit card companies give you credit cards, is they want you to spend money on impulse. Because the more you spend, the more likely it is you're going to be paying them interest and the more money they will make. But the problem is when you buy on impulse, particularly when you're living on credit, then you really probably can't afford that impulse. And I certainly realized that by the time I got home, an hour after I'd seen this fountain, that I no longer wanted it. Now you could say, well, that's all right, just return it. Well, that can work as long as the store is going to give you your money back. But in this case, that was a store that only would have given me an in-store credit, and there's nothing at that store that I needed. But there's also purchases we make in life that you can't return and get your money back that are much more routine. For example, if on Friday night you go out and perhaps you eat some and you drink some and perhaps you eat some or eat more or drink more than you really wanted to, and so Saturday morning you wake up and you've decided you'd like to return some of what you ate and drank, you're not going to be able to get the money back. You certainly can return it if you want, but you're not going to get your money back. So recognize that impulsive buying, which is a very common human behavior, is not a strategy for success when you're trying to make sure you're spending only what you need to. So be very careful about walking around with credit cards that would allow you to buy things you can't really afford. But the same is also true with debit cards, because most people don't have a photographic mind and therefore aren't absolutely aware of exactly how much is left in their checking account for that month. But if you're using cash, then at least you have a better sense of that. Now, if you like to use online tools when it comes to budgeting, probably the most commonly used online tool that's free is Mint.com. Now, I've never used Mint.com, but you certainly can explore the use of tools. I wouldn't pay anyone, though, to use a tool because your budgets aren't that sophisticated that you need to have tools and features that you'd have to pay for. But also make sure you don't run out of funds. This is why I'd encourage you to make sure that that refund that you got at the beginning of the semester and that you'll get at the beginning of each semester, that rather than holding it in the account you're spending from every day, you consider putting it in a holding account. Because that way, if you then pay yourself on a monthly basis, you're more likely to make sure that you don't run out of money before you intended. Because if you do, that's going to be a source of stress and may cause you to have to start relying more heavily on credit cards or debt with a capital D. Now, when it comes to managing your loans, unfortunately, you've got to start now because you've got to be strategic about this and you've got to plan ahead. And at a minimum, you need to make sure you're doing one thing, that you've signed up to get access to your account with your loan servicer on their website, because that's where all of the actions occur. Your lender is the Department of Education for the loans you're borrowing here at the law school, but they do not manage the loans themselves. They contract that out to third parties. So you want to make sure that you have access to your account with that third party. But there's a couple of other things you should be doing as well. Do not ignore all of that mail you're getting from the servicer, either electronically or by paper. I know, they send you a lot of it, and they send you information at least once a month. And what you want to make sure is that you check the mail to be certain that they have not made a mistake. The mistake being that they have not accidentally put your loans into repayment sooner than they should have. Because that has happened in the past. In 2012, one of the biggest servicers of federal loans put in a new computer system. And in January of that year, when the spring disbursement of the borrower's Grad Plus loans were dispersed, and therefore the loans went into repayment, because on a Grad Plus loan, it doesn't have a grace period. It goes into repayment as soon as it's fully dispersed. But since you're in school at least half time, you're eligible for an in-school deferment, which is to be applied automatically, so that you don't have to request it. Well, this servicer's computer system, instead of putting those Grad Plus loans automatically into an in-school deferment, as it should have, it put them into active repayment and started sending out monthly billing statements. Now, sometime later, the servicer became aware that this was a problem. Now, for whatever reason, they'd made the decision to not go in and just automatically fix the problem and put all those loans into deferment. They made the decision, well, we'll let borrowers just contact us, because they're getting the bills. When they get the bill and they realize they shouldn't be paying it, they'll call us. Well, the problem was that many students who were getting those bills weren't opening the bills, so they didn't know that they were getting bills. Now, in May, when the continuing students were applying for their Grad Plus loans for the next year, they were getting denied, because they were now more than 90 days past due on that payment they weren't supposed to even be making. But their credit history showed that they were more than 90 days past due, so they were denied the Grad Plus loan. And this was in May, a time when they were busy studying for and taking final exams. And that was an added stress, all right? So if they'd been opening their mail all along the way, then they could have solved the problem back in January or February, where it would have been easier and faster to remediate. So again, I hope there are never going to be any mistakes made with how your loans are serviced. But it is important to be monitoring those communications to make sure that you're not being offered something, for example, that could lower the cost of the debt to you, or that some mistake hasn't been made that might cause your loans to be going into repayment sooner than they should have. Does that make sense? Now, what do you need to know about your loans? Well, you need to know all of these things, but particularly what you need to know is who the servicer is and when repayment's going to begin, so that you're prepared for that once repayment begins. And the NSLDS website, the National Student Loan Data System, is a database that lists all of the federal loans you've ever borrowed. So you can always find out all that information about your loans by simply clicking on the Financial Aid Review option and then going out to this website. Because on the main screen, which is going to be the summary screen, it's going to list the type of loans and the amount you owe. And the amount you owe is the sum of the outstanding principal and the accrued interest. So it's the combined of those two. And then if you click on the number in the first column, then you can see the details, where it's going to tell you when the loan is scheduled to enter repayment, who the servicer is, what is the status, and what is the interest rate. So it can give you most of the information you need to know about your loans. So again, I encourage you to take a look and to utilize that resource. It's one of the things that we look at when I meet with students individually, so that we understand what their portfolio of loans looks like. Now, the interest rate on your loans are fixed. It's not something you get to negotiate, and it's not dependent upon your credit or anything else. Everybody's paying the same interest rate. But the rates are a little bit unusual in that they're what we call a variable fixed rate. Because the rate changes each year on July 1st for new loans, based upon how the 10-year Treasury note has changed. And then there is a margin or a spread added to it. And so for the loans you're borrowing this year through the unsubsidized direct program, the rate is 6.21%. But if you're going to be borrowing loans next year and beyond, the rate for those loans is not yet known. It won't be known until July 1st of that year, but the rate will be somewhere between the minimum amount, which is the spread, and a maximum cap of 9.5.
Sorry, my printout has 7.2.
Okay, that's on the next slide. I think you're looking at the Grad Plus.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay, this is for the unsubsidized staffing. Now, you might say, well, boy, those are high rates. Well, they're higher than mortgages, but remember, with a home mortgage, that rate is secured, or that debt is secured by the asset, the home. So that reduces the risk to the lender that you're going to default on that loan. If you want to compare these rates to a comparable type of credit, you'd want to be comparing to the rates on credit cards. So in that sense, they're really a pretty good deal. Now for the Grad Plus, the rate is 1% higher because the amount added to the index is 1% higher, and the cap is 1% higher. So it's a little bit more expensive loan. That's why you want to maximize the amount of the unsubsidized direct student loan before you borrow Grad Plus. And the maximum amount of unsub that you can borrow per year is $20,500. Any questions about the interest rates?
I get lots of emails from Senator Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts, and one of them stated recently that the Republicans in Congress are trying to toy with interest rates on student loans. And it has me a little concerned. Are they trying to raise the rates? Do you know what's going on with that?
Okay. The comment was that it appears as though Congress is looking at possibly changing rates, and in particular Senator Warren from Massachusetts is very concerned because she thinks the rates are too high. So she's actually introduced legislation that would lower the rates. Now the problem is that if you lower the rate, because that interest represents revenue to the federal government, and the budget rules that Congress has to adhere to because of the federal deficit require that if we reduce revenue from one source, we've got to increase revenue from another source or cut costs somewhere. And unfortunately, Senator Warren has proposed in her legislation that in order to offset the revenue loss, she would just increase the taxes that people with incomes over $1 million would pay. Now there are those in Congress who don't agree with that approach. They tend to be on the right-hand side of the aisle, not the left-hand side. And so it tends to be the Republicans, all right? I'm not aware of anyone that's saying they should raise the rates, but there are members of Congress who would like to lower the rates because they don't think that students should be providing funds to the federal government that is a source of revenue and basically profit for the federal government. And so she'd like to lower the rates because what you're paying is not equivalent to what it's costing the government to loan you that money. You're paying more than what it's costing them to loan you the money, and she says it should be a zero-sum situation. Yes, we should cover the costs, but not be exceeding the costs, because that's on the backs of students. So there is certainly the possibility that the rates will change, but whenever the rates have been changed in the past, they've only changed for new loans or new borrowers. They haven't affected any existing loans. Now, there's the possibility that if somehow the rates get lowered through a congressional change in the structure, that you may be given the opportunity to somehow refinance the loans or take advantage of those lower rates. That will depend upon how the legislation is written. But if they change the structure such that it would raise the rates, then that would likely only affect new loans or new borrowers, not any existing loans you already have.
And if when you get out of law school you want to refinance but the rates are higher, would they then put you on a higher rate?
Right. The question is, if you want to refinance after you get out of law school, that would be through consolidation. Right now, the consolidation process it changes the rate, but it doesn't really raise it by much. The rate on a consolidation loan, which is how you could refinance it, is equal to the weighted average of the interest rates on the loans that currently exist, and then it's rounded up to the nearest eighth. So it likely would not change the rate structure. If they allow you the ability to refinance so that you can get a lower rate, then that will be a part of that feature. But if not, then if you refinance the loans because there was some other reason to do so, it will only slightly increase the interest expense because of how the rate is calculated. But it won't be subject to a whole new rate structure. Okay. Any other questions about the interest rate? All right. So who is the loan servicer? Well, it's the company that's managing your loans. And for the loans you're borrowing here at the law school, it's one of four companies. Fed Loan Servicing, Great Lakes, Nelnet, or Sallie Mae, which as of a week ago Monday is now called Navient. So if your loans were being serviced by Sallie Mae, you recently received a communication saying that now the servicer is Navient. It's the same corporate entity, it's just a nonprofit subsidiary of Sallie Mae, and it means that instead of going to SallieMae.com, you'll be using the website Navient.com, but the phone number is unchanged. The others, these are the four servicers. So all of your direct loans should be with one of these companies. And if you're not sure who it is, just open your mail, because you're getting mail from them at least once a month, because you're at least getting a monthly interest statement telling you how much interest is accrued that month. Now, the government decides who your servicer is, and they also have the right to move your loans to a different servicer. That isn't that they're selling the loans, they're simply assigning them to a different contractor. If that happens, they'll move them all together, and they'll notify you that that change has occurred. If you're ever unsure of who the servicer is, again, you can always check the details of NSLDS, because that information will always be displayed there as well. Any questions about the servicer?
I was going to ask about the NSLDS. That's regularly updated with the new servicer.
Yes, NSLDS is updated. It's not real time, but within probably a week or two it is updated. And I've noticed that it's already been updated to show that if your loans were serviced by Sallie Mae, they're now being serviced by NABI. Yeah, so it's not real time, but it's only lagged a couple of weeks. Repayment options, you want to focus on color here. You want to focus on the plans in white, not the plans in blue. The plans in blue, the oldest of the plans, which are basically obsolete now, base your monthly payment on your debt. So that's like debt with a capital D. And you're not going to want to do that. You're going to want to base your monthly payment on your income. Now, if you didn't have loans prior to October 1st of 2007, which probably many of you did not, then you're eligible for the newest of the income-driven plans called Pay-As-You-Earn. And with that plan, your monthly payments would actually be less than 10% of your household's monthly adjusted gross income, rather than that 15%, and the debt would be forgiven after 20 years, not 25 years, if you still have debt remaining after being in repayment for 20 years. I use the 15% because everybody's eligible for income-based repayment, but only certain borrowers, new borrowers, are eligible for Pay-As-You-Earn. Now, if you're not a new borrower, there's nothing you can do to make yourself a new borrower. But we also know that the government is going to be changing the rules about this within the next 18 months. And it's going to increase who's eligible for Pay-As-You-Earn. And if that happens, then you may become eligible not because of something you did, but because of something Congress or the Department of Education did. There's also been proposals to make Pay-As-You-Earn the only payment plan. And it's really the only plan we need, because it's the plan that makes the most financial sense. But at least for now, you're going to have a choice. You make that choice or that decision when the loans are going into repayment. And by the way, when are your loans going to enter repayment? The loans from law school are going to enter repayment 6 months after you graduate. Your Stafford loans, the unsubsidized direct student loan, has a 6-month grace period. So it's going to have an automatic 6-month delay before it enters repayment. The Grad Plus loans actually go into repayment as soon as they're fully dispersed. So you're going to get notifications that as soon as it's fully dispersed at the beginning of the spring semester, you're going to get notice that the loan's gone into repayment, but then it's also going to get notice that it's gone into an in-school deferment. It's been deferred, which was automatic, or at least it's supposed to be. That deferment will last until you're no longer in school. Then you'll get notification that that deferment has ended, but then you're going to get another deferment that's automatic for 6 months that's tied to the Grad Plus loan, which acts like a grace period, but it's technically a deferment. But effectively, you're going to get 6 months for the loans you're borrowing in law school. But what about loans you borrowed before coming to law school? If you were out of school long enough such that they entered repayment, then they're in an in-school deferment now, but they're going to go back into repayment as soon as you graduate. If you came back to school before they entered repayment such that you didn't use up the grace period or that automatic deferment on the Grad Plus, then you'll still have the grace period and that automatic deferment on those prior loans once you graduate from law school. So you could have loans entering repayment if you have loans from prior to law school at different points in time. So it becomes important then to make sure you know that, so that you know what steps you need to take to manage those loans once in repayment. And that's one of the things I focus on when I meet with students individually, and that we'll talk more about in the repayment seminar in the spring. If you want to get a sense of what your monthly payments would look like, you can use the repayment estimator out at studentloans.gov. Studentloans.gov is the website where you apply for your direct loans. And if you sign in, then in this lower section of that main screen, it'll have a box that says Tools and Calculators. And if you click on the repayment estimator, it will allow you to see how much you currently owe and what the monthly payments would be. And then you can actually add in the amount you expect to have to borrow to finish your degree. And then you can sort of do some projections about how much you'd have to pay per month, given the various options. And it includes the ability to enter in income amounts that you think you'll be earning to see how your monthly payments would vary based upon those plans that base it upon your debt versus those plans that base it upon your income. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that tool. It's one of the tools that I use when I meet with students individually. Any questions about the loans themselves and about these features and attributes we've been talking about? So how can you reduce your borrowing? Well, the easiest way to reduce your borrowing is either to reduce your spending or increase your resources in terms of scholarships and grants or income. So again, make sure that you're doing everything you can to increase the amount of free money that you're using. Now, to do that, it means applying for scholarships and grants from organizations other than the law school. And Audrey, where do they post information about outside scholarships that the school is made aware of? Do you know?
Yeah, we posted at the Student Boulevard. We have a wall.
Okay.
And I have some on the bulletin board by the office.
Okay.
These are outside
Right.
scholarships.
Yeah, there are organizations like local or regional bar associations, other organizations that have an interest in some area of the law, where they're willing through a competitive process to give scholarships to law students who have interest in those areas of the law. Particularly once you're a second or third year student, again, don't take advantage of those. There isn't a lot of money, but again, it helps reduce how much you have to borrow. And did you know that if you borrowed more than you needed for the term, you can return funds for up to the first 120 days of that disbursement? And if you return funds within the first 120 days of the disbursement, which is basically the first 4 months, then it's as though you never borrowed the money. Any interest and fees that were assessed on that portion will be credited back. So it reduces the principal outstanding balance by the amount you've returned, and then the interest and fees that had accrued on that portion get credited back. And Audrey, should they just do this directly through their servicer, or do they do it through the university?
I was going to make that, clarify that. If you know that you've gotten more than you need at the time of disbursement, because everything is processed at the main campus, they give you 10 days, okay, 10 business days to return it to them, and they'll return it to the lender. After that 10 days, then you'd have to return it on your own.
And it's easy to return it. All you have to do is call your servicer and tell them you want to return a portion of a disbursement you've received. They'll tell you procedurally how to do it. All you have to do is go out to their website and you can submit the payment online, and it's just very easy to do. They're going to reduce the loan that has the highest interest rate. So if you're returning funds and you had a Grad Plus, they should reduce the amount of your Grad Plus because that saves you more.
Especially a good point about the Grad Plus. When you return the funds, I've helped other students. When you return the funds, you can tell them where you want those funds to go towards, which loan. And of course, you want it to go towards a higher interest loan. So usually that's the Grad Plus.
Right.
Okay. If you do it by check, then you have to write it on the check. Okay.
Yeah.
You tell them as well as.
And technically, if they get money back if they get a payment from a borrower within that first 120 days of when they see a disbursement has occurred, they are supposed to treat it as a return of funds. Mm-hmm. And they're supposed to return it and apply it to the account that has the highest interest rate. But you don't want to necessarily assume they're going to do it correctly. And I would never do it by check. I would always do it as an online transaction because that way it happens a lot faster. And number two, it gives you more control. But I would also always call the servicer before you do it to make sure that you know procedurally how to do it and that you're intending it as a return of funds. Now, once you're outside of the 120-day window, then it's treated as a prepayment. You still have the ability to target it at a specific loan, but now it's going to pay off interest before it pays down principal. Because anytime you submit a payment rather than a return of funds, it does have to pay off interest that's outstanding and accrued before it reduces principal. But there's also something else you need to know, and this gets to the issue about why you shouldn't be paying interest as it's accruing. The interest that's accruing on your federal student loans is accruing as simple interest. In other words, it's not compounding. You're not paying interest on the interest. Now, it is going to get added to the principal balance, a process that's called capitalization, when the loans enter repayment, which in the case of your law school loans will be 6 months after you graduate. But until then, that interest is not costing you anything. It's the outstanding principal balance that's accruing the interest. So if you had the means to pay that interest as it's accruing, it would be better to simply reduce how much you're borrowing, because it's the amount you're borrowing that's accruing the interest right now, not the interest itself. And that's why it is not in your best interest financially to be paying that interest while you're in school. Even though the government and the servicer have suggested you should do so, That's because behaviorally, they know that the sooner they get you in the habit of making payments, the greater the probability you'll always make payments on time. And that's what they're concerned about. They're not necessarily concerned about what's in your best interest financially. Does that make sense? So final comments. Remember, you want to study hard and you want to make the most of this investment. And your investment is to get admitted to the bar in some jurisdiction, of which a prerequisite is getting a law degree. And in order to make the most of this investment, you need to be doing two things. You need to be studying and sleeping. And it's when you're not studying and not sleeping that you're likely going to get into trouble, both in terms of possibly distracting yourself from doing as well as you can academically, but also in terms of possibly spending money you didn't need to spend. So just be mindful of that, because you want to make sure that if you want to be borrowing the right amount, you need to be spending the right amount. And make sure you spend that little bit of time necessary to be managing your finances and managing your loans so that everything is going forward in the way it should. If you need more information, you always want to start with the financial aid office, because they're here to serve you, particularly in terms of getting the financial aid you need. If you have specific questions about your loans and how they're being serviced, then you'd want to contact the loan servicer. If you're interested in getting more information about these programs on the internet, then it's best to use the Department of Education's websites. And studentaid.gov is the site that has general information about the federal aid programs. The studentloans.gov is where the information is located that's specific to the federal loans. If you're interested in a career in public service and are planning to work either with a government agency or a nonprofit, and therefore want to take advantage of public service loan forgiveness, information about that is out at studentaid.ed.gov/public service, and I'd encourage you to try to come to the seminar tonight at 5 o'clock in this same room, or at least to watch the video of it if you can, because we're going to be talking very specifically about that program. Again, at nslds.ed.gov, you can see the complete history of all of the federal loans you've ever borrowed, even if some of them have been paid back already. And if you have private student loans, they're not going to show up on NSLDS, but you need to have information about those as well. And the best place to find information about those, if you're not sure who the lender is to check your credit report. And as a result of the Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act of 2003, or the FACT Act, you have the right to a free copy of your credit report from each of the 3 national consumer reporting agencies, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, once every 12 months. But you have to obtain it through the portal they've created out at annualcreditreport.com. Now that's going to give you your credit report. It will not give you your credit score. You have to pay to get your credit score, but I'm not sure that's something that you necessarily need. But again, utilize these tools because they can be helpful to you. Remember, you're making an important investment in yourself. You're going to graduate with an educational mortgage. You want to make sure that that mortgage represents the right amount that you needed to obtain your goal, which was to be admitted to the bar and be working in some capacity with your degree. But it involves costs in addition to what you're paying here at the university, so make sure as you're figuring out your spending that you're taking into account not just the 9 months of each academic year, but the time it's going to take between now and when you're actually going to achieve your ultimate goal, to make sure that you have all the resources you need to cover your expenses. And to the extent you have to borrow money, it would be better to be borrowing federal student loans, this debt with a little d, that's flexible and has a lot more safety built into it, than to be relying upon your credit cards or private student loans. Remember, this is an investment you're making yourself that's going to allow you to do things that otherwise you couldn't have done. I hope you can make the best investment possible, but to do so, it really involves being strategic. With that, I hope it's been helpful to you today. Good luck to all of you. If you have individual questions, I'll stick around afterwards. Remember, if you want to meet with me individually, check with Audrey in the Financial Aid Office. There may be a few opportunities yet this week, but I'll also be back in February and March, and you're certainly welcome to meet with me at that time. Any last questions?
I have one. I know that the starting salary of a lawyer in San Francisco is $80,000 a year, and if you do the math, 15% of that is $12,000 times 20 years is $240,000, not counting interest. Mm-hmm. Now, that is exactly what most of us are borrowing. So that means that after 20 years, we would have paid off our loans. And I've worked for government agencies where they have like the public interest loan repayment program. And it usually works out the same way. If you're making the minimum payment for the maximum number of years, you've paid off your loan by the time they might kick in and pay off what's left. Okay. So does this actually ever help anyone?
Now, the question and the comment is he's done some math, and his math has suggested that he's actually going to have the debt paid off in 20 or 25 years if he were earning $80,000 a year. I think your math isn't quite right because you have not factored in the interest, and the interest is a major part of the cost. And so if you factor in the interest, I think you'll see that the majority of law students today, given what their average starting salaries are and how those incomes might increase over time, likely will have some debt left to forgive. But my point wasn't that you want to try to get debt forgiven. That's a safety net. My point is that in choosing the payment plan that gives you the lowest required monthly payment, it's giving you the flexibility to either be paying extra towards your loans if you want to, but in a targeted way at the more expensive debt, or to be using that money for some other purpose, which if from an opportunity cost standpoint, that alternative purpose would have more value to you, then you are now better off. All right? So I think you have to be a little bit careful about making assumptions on the back of a piece of paper. If you want to do some analysis, use that calculator on studentloans.gov, because it's going to factor in the reality that interest is accruing throughout the life of repayment. And so I think it'll give you a more accurate picture than trying to do some calculations just by hand, because it's not as simple as you've done in terms of math. Okay, yeah. And that is unfortunately a major factor. You also want to be careful. You used $80,000. That is not what lawyers are paid in San Francisco. Okay, that may be the average amount some lawyers might get paid. But what lawyers get paid in San Francisco ranges from nothing to over $100,000. So you also want to be a little careful about the income assumptions you make when doing these assessments, because you don't, unless you have the job and you know what your salary is going to be, I would encourage you to be a little conservative in terms of looking at possibly several different income scenarios. But my whole point about the forgiveness wasn't that you should be striving to get debt forgiven, because there's nothing that guarantees that Congress is going to change those benefits and take them away from you. And there's nothing in the promissory note you sign that guarantees you'd be grandfathered into the existing terms. My point was that you want to make sure that in deciding how much to borrow, you're borrowing the right amount to achieve your goal, and that if you have to borrow, you're borrowing from loans that give you the flexibility to make adjustments based upon how your circumstances change. And number two, that once you start paying it back, that you're paying it back in a way that isn't causing you to incur costs in the sense of opportunity costs, lost benefits, that would have exceeded the cost that you're saving by paying off the debt more quickly. Because if you're doing that, you may not be better off financially. The choice is yours. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks very much for your time. Good luck to all of you.